Welcome to the Stoa. The Stoa is a digital campfire where we cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of what's happening now. Okay, check-ins. I'm just gonna give you the co-host access, Raven. Do you have it? If you can let people in while I'm talking.
Thank you.
Do you have co-host access? Can't find your name.
I do not.
Okay, I'll figure it out in a moment. All right, so check-ins. I'm 11% nervous. I feel calm. I feel kind of like there's like a really nice thumos coming up because I was reading the side view earlier and it was really, really good. And I brought my turtleneck game for everyone because that's how much I think this issue is awesome. So welcome to the Stoa. I am Peter Lindbergh, the steward of the Stoa, and the Stoa is a place for us to cohere and dialogue about what matters most at the knife's edge of this moment. And today we have a party, the Side View launch party. And we have the creator, the editor of the Side View, Adam Roberts, here today, or Adam Robbert, I should say. And what's going to happen is him and I are going to jam. We're going to have a conversation about the Side View, about this particular issue for maybe 10, 20 minutes, so like a podcast format. And if you have any questions or any statements, just write it into the chat box. We'll give a chance. There's a lot of the authors in the chat room today, so we're gonna have a chance to have people to speak. I'm gonna police any loquaciousness because we only have 60 minutes of the recorded session, so let's be cognizant of everyone in the space. And then after the 60 minutes, the lovely Blackbird Raven Connolly is going to do a sense-making session. Raven, do you want to speak on that just a little bit?
Of course. Hi, everyone. So the 30-minute sense-making session is just more like a roundtable discussion where everyone can have their voice heard, and we'll be talking about questions that come up in this recorded session, and I'll be keeping track of statements and questions that come up in the chat to bring to the discussion for the half hour of sense-making towards the end. So invite you all to stay and join us for the discussion. Be wonderful. Thank you.
Beautiful. So after the 60 minutes, if you want to leave, you can leave and we'll stop recording and then I'll hand it to Raven for the sense-making session. So that being said, Adam, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Peter. Thanks so much for having me. It's so nice to see everybody. I mean, I feel like we have contributors new and old in the audience. Like this is, I mean, it's kind of amazing to me to just see all these folks show up for the Side View, and it's really great.
Cool. And how you feeling, man? You excited? You released it? Like, what's that feeling like? Just launching into the world.
It feels really good. I mean, you sit on something like this for months and months, and so many of the writers, many of them are here, and I want to hear from them later, but so many of them have put together just such a rich collection of, I mean, every essay is just, I mean, a gem to itself, and I just couldn't be happier with how this came together, and the way it came together just felt so natural. Where there was just something in the air about this moment that I tried to capture with my call, and it was just like, every person that you might imagine or want to show up in response to that call showed up. So yeah, I couldn't be happier. And I know all the writers put in a lot of work on their pieces, and we put in a lot of work, putting it on the website, editing. Alex Criddle helped with putting the journal together, and so it really takes a village, and yeah, really happy with how it turned out.
And I've been reading the essays, and it's just like geeking out about it. So this is my jam right here. This is sort of like my sense making tribe making sense, and it's putting me at the edge of my thinking just reading the essays. So before we get into this particular episode or essay, or I should say article, what is the Side View? Like what is it about? Why'd you start it?
Yeah, that's a good question. The side view is, well, it's an idea, or it's an approach, or it's a perspective. It's an attitude, it's a practice, it's maybe a disposition, and it's this multimedia environment. So if you're not if you're not familiar with the side view, or if this is just your first time checking it out, we do these essays. We publish the essays online, but we also publish them in print. The print is coming a little later this time, and as a digital download, so you can kind of read them and share them online, or you can download them and kind of. I still prefer that kind of slower digest of having the whole, the especially with this issue, the whole really matters. It's not just 13 essays that are loosely related. They do come together into kind of an emergent structure, and so for me, just having that ability to kind of take them all in at once is really important. So we offer them in the journal format, and then we also do podcasts. I've done some events, just like live speaking events. We're hoping to do more of that kind of thing in the future. Nick Breisowitz is here for issue 2. We did a little launch event at the Interval in San Francisco, a really neat cocktail bar run by the Long Now Foundation that he's a part of. So we're trying to move out of like a single format or a single medium, because so much of what we do involves practice. It involves not just you and your whole body, in action, but groups of people, communities. It involves art and religion and spirituality and science and all of these different things that you can only capture a certain dimension of them in sort of traditionally academic discursive settings. So we're trying to like hit it in all of these different ways. So the side view is that. I don't know what else I should say about it. I guess the name is kind of the attitude, right? We're trying to look at things from the side, from a side view, which basically just means you're trying to understand not just. If you look at a lot of history books, for example, you see that if you're looking at a history of philosophy, for example, you see a history of completed texts, completed works, sort of set epochs and periods, and it's all there. It's just everything is there in the finished product. But the side view perspective is to actually try and take on all of the practices and experiences and intuitions and methods that actually led those people to create the things that we kind of see as the finished product. So that's really what the side view is. It's a focus on the practice that leads to the book, the artwork, the scientific discovery, the technological achievement.
Right. And you and I were talking last week about, this is my opinion, but I think other people share this opinion as well, is that how the side view is sort of like the gold standard of like a para academic journal in this sort of sense-making web, game B, meta-modern space, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And you and I both belong to the same philosophical lineage with basically Pierre Hadot, and Pierre Hadot was mentioned multiple times in the side view with Nick's paper, with Brent's paper. So maybe you can talk about how it's sort of like that para-academic journal thing, and also how Pierre Hadot plays such a central role in your kind of thought and the side view.
Yeah, I mean those two things are definitely related for me. I mean, Pierre Hadot. If you don't know who Pierre Hadot is, he's a huge influence on me. He's a huge influence on the side view. He wrote a series of books that were very much built around this idea of recovering the practice of philosophy, or what he called philosophy as a way of life. And he saw philosophy as first and foremost rooted in these practices that he called spiritual exercises. You could also think of them as like existential exercises. And the word that he used to describe these practices is ascesis. Ascesis, you might recognize, is very similar to another word, ascetic, which we still see used today quite frequently, which people to think of as sort of like some kind of an act of abstinence or celibacy or withdrawal in kind of a monkish way. You're kind of withdrawing to the monastery and abstaining from sort of ordinary life. Hadot's definition is a little bit broader in that he views ascesis, the general definition he gives of ascesis is of any exercise that you engage in on purpose in order to transform yourself, and particularly in order to transform your perception. So right there, he sees this kind of deep link between your being as a person, who you are, how you are, and what you're able to see and do in the world. And so those things are united in this notion of practice. And so through practice, we change who we are. And in changing who we are, we change how we see and what we're able to do. So we're really talking about a certain kind of perceptual transformation here, or some people today use the word perceptual learning, is a phrase that they use in cognitive science to describe the way that not just your cognitive understanding changes when you sort of gain intellectual knowledge, but how your physical senses, your bodily senses actually change. You actually transform sensation at a pretty deep level. And I get all of that from Hadot and other people. He's certainly not alone in it. He's sort of the person who invited that notion into my life. And so I continue to think with him and continue to be inspired by him. But he also, in addition to having that kind of, deeper understanding of what philosophy is, also had quite a lot of opinions about how philosophy was taught in these earlier Greek contexts and how it's taught today. And he definitely sees a loss of a kind of the existential or spiritual, or in some contexts you could say religious dimension, the therapeutic dimension perhaps, that has always been a part of philosophy, has been something happened to it. Something happened to it with, we don't have to go into the whole history that he gives of it, but something happened to it with the rise of the modern university system, where we got into a focus of getting really good at learning about texts and learning how to criticize texts and building up these figures who have these kind of encyclopedic knowledge of the history of philosophy without very much emphasis on the practice of philosophy in their daily lives. And so that's also a part of what the side view is. It's on the one hand recognizing that there are aspects of the academic process. There's a real lineage and a real tradition that goes back thousands of years of teachers and students, of mastery, of really understanding what philosophy is, like, a lifetime of study, acknowledging that that's important, but also recognizing that somehow that needs to be brought back out into the world in a way that it just isn't right now. So the side view, circulates freely on the internet. It has elements of an academic journal. It's certainly not popular reading, I would say, but it's also not. It's not lodged behind a paywall that's inaccessible, both financially and because a lot of arcane jargon is used in a kind of insider baseball conversation that's only relevant to a handful of people. So we're trying to bring it out into the open. I do think that you need that desire to kind of get into some of these pieces. They're not, this isn't the Huffington Post, to put it that way. It still demands something of you, but at the same time, it doesn't demand that you have a graduate degree. It just demands that you're interested and that you're willing to put in a little bit of work to get, I think, a deeper understanding. So we try to share it everywhere, and also again try and bring people into the process so that maybe they can start putting some of these things into practice in their own life. I've seen over the past few years just a tremendous amount of interest in like philosophers, academics of all kinds going on YouTube and, giving their lectures, and thousands, tens of thousands, sometimes hundreds of thousands or millions of people are viewing these lectures, but then kind of seeing where they take that conversation and realizing like, oh, they're not really getting a way into being able to reproduce those insights for themselves. So that the pedagogy that you would get in a traditional context isn't quite there. So can we do something about that? Can we bring it out into the open, but without having that sort of precipitous drop off between like the genius YouTube broadcaster and the ugliness that transpires in the comments below, something like that. So the side view is trying to move into that space.
That's great. That's great. And as Raymond knows, I get angry with the galaxy brains and the YouTube things. So if you have any questions, start throwing them in the chat box. And I think we were thinking about allowing each sort of author to have a chance to speak. I'm going to veto that because intellectuals usually talk a lot, and we have a certain time period right here, and I want to kind of police loquacious things. So if you have a question for either Adam or any author in the chat right now, because there's a bunch here. We have Juanita Roy, we have Brent, we have my favorite drinking buddy, Christopher, we have Nicholas, Jason, Jeremy. We have a bunch of them here. So if you have any questions for any of the authors, if you read some of the piece, write in the chat box. And if you're an author and you have a question for Adam or another author, you can write it to them. I wrote a piece too on mimetic mediation. Feel free to ask me a question. So just throw it in the chat box, and I'll warm Adam up with a question about this latest release. So you have 3 sections. You have the wayfinding cultures, ecology of practices, and meta-modernism. I'm curious, did these just naturally emerge, or were you kind of looking for these themes?
No, they're there. And I mean, in some sense, they're really obviously there, and in some sense, they're a little bit more subtly, but we can go through the 3 of them. The wayfinding cultures is, well, Bonita in her essay talks about wayfinding. Wayfinding is a kind of sense-making, but it's the way she talks about it. Maybe Bonita wants to speak to it, but she's talking about it in, I want to back up a little bit, actually, because the way we talk about sense making on the side view is a little bit different from the way sense making is used in the kind of the larger conversation. They overlap and they're related, but they're also a little bit different. And if you read like Bonita's essay, you get this notion of sense making that's coming out of the enactivist tradition that draws on people like Merleau-Ponty and Francisco Varela, Evan Thompson, all kinds of figures. And that notion of sense making is really kind of opening up how our perception works, our lived experience, our day-to-day sense of reality and our sense of salience and meaning and how we navigate and all of those things. And Bonita picked up this example of wayfinding, wayfaring, seafaring, all of these different ways that people learn how to get around territories where they don't really have a good representational model like we usually think about it. So there's that piece coming from Bonita. Nick, in his piece, is talking about civilizational scale perception. How do we think on the scale of 10,000 years in either direction, right? That's the Long Now Foundation's thing. And how do you embody that? And so we're kind of doing this exercise in the issues called collective navigation. So it's this kind of collective sense making at the level of civilizations, right? Can we do that? Is that something we can do? That's like a question for me. And what does it have to do with these other sort of more embodied, more individual, more internal modes of perception? Is it just connecting up, or what are the emergent properties? What are the feedback loops? What's feeding back down? What's feeding up? All those kinds of things. And Wolf Wolf Tivy. Sorry if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Wolf. Also had this kind of bigger scale, image of how would you actually run a society if you were in charge of it? How would you do that? And same thing with Nora Bateson's essay. She has this kind of group. It's a kind of like participatory sense making. It's like complexity science in the first person. And so like that's kind of the first group, and they all just fit together really nicely. And so it's this idea of like collective sense making. Can we like what are some of the words that we can put to that? The second one, ecology of practice, centers a little bit around John Vervaeke, Christopher Mastropietro, who I'm meeting for the first time virtually. I can see him in the little chat box down there. Just this notion of the meaning crisis and the ecology of practice, ecologies of practice that we can bring to the meaning crisis. And so that kind of was the orbit around that group of essays. Davoud Gosley had an essay where he was raising some really salient points about are we alleviating alienation and atomization by engaging with each other through YouTube videos, through podcasts? It's a very singular kind of activity. Maybe there's something structural that's going wrong there, so that we're listening to all this good stuff about how to overcome the meaning crisis, and yet we're doing it, alone with our AirPods, our earbuds in kind of still in that isolated, atomized mode. Or Jessica Burton kind of spun the whole thing on its head, and if you listen to Jessica, she's having a great time online. It's like there's ideas flowing, there's all this interaction is happening, and things are mutating and evolving like in real time, and you get a really different sense. So there's all these different kinds of ecologies of practice and action transpiring. And then of course we have, I won't speak to your essay, Peter, but maybe you and Jason can say something about your mediation pieces at some point. And then the last section was meta-modernism. That one was really easy because we have three really strong takes on meta-modernism. Just what is it? And I was kind of new to the whole thing coming into this, and I learned through these essays and following the breadcrumbs that they left, going through the links that they left, going through the reference lists. And so we have these different accounts of meta-modernism. So the major sections were just kind of there. It was just a matter of putting them in the right sequence.
Right. So we'll turn to the questions now. It's just to circle back to something we talked about last week, which I think is really cool and I'm excited for, how you want on your podcast, the Side View podcast, where you want certain people to talk to each other. Because I just read Davoud's article and I was like, oh my God, that was awesome, right? He did some shot fires at John Vervaeke, so it'd be good to have them to talk on your podcast.
Yeah.
So I'm really looking forward to that. So Benita Roy, you have a question.
Yeah, I wanted you to ask it, but here I am in service. So, Adam, I wanted to ask you, like, you called the invitation, and I think that sets up some kind of like field. Mm-hmm. But is there something that like really threw you off, like surprised you? Like, is this going? Where is this going? Like, what was something that was salient, that was unexpected in what you received, for better or for worse?
Well, I'm a little bit curious about what's in the water in Toronto. I didn't really understand that Peter and John and Chris and Davoud have all these prior relationships with each other. And I had no idea about any of that. And I still don't really know how those relationships hang together. But they write about each other. And in a very, I think, there's a little bit of there's a zeitgeisty charge to what's happening over there. And I didn't know about it. And I actually didn't even know about it reading essays. It was something that I learned after the fact. And then there's just, there's Jeremy Johnson's here. He's just another one of those guys where you're just like, something's happening with this guy. It's really interesting. I had been reading Jean Gebser, years ago. And I think whatever, it was just the context. I thought he was really interesting, but some of the folks who were into him, I just didn't think it wasn't alive for me. And then Jeremy wrote this wonderful book on Gebser that I highly recommend to you all. And it kind of like, it gave this whole fresh spin on it. And I realized reading it that's Jeremy. That's Jeremy coming through there. And he did the same thing with his essay. And so of course it's like you try and put something out there, and you don't know what's going to happen, and you don't know what's going to come back, and you don't know what it's going to look like. And so you just have to have some faith that it's there and that you're touching something real. Some of the links in the intro essay I wrote were from, but last year there was a fellow, Peter, Jason, maybe you can remind me his name. He has an anonymous account that he created these graphs of how all of the podcasts and social media accounts fit together in these like multicolored webs in a really neat way. And I had a little bit of an epiphany looking at those, because I realized that I had done so much of what I had done with the side view independently of knowing about any of this other stuff, And so all of a sudden somebody had given me this visual tool to see this emergent structure that what I was doing was like in the middle of like this little piece right there. But it was like, oh, we all responded to some kind of ambient signal, and this structure sort of crystallized. And so with this issue, I wanted to like kind of capture that feeling just by invoking some of the words that were kind of involved in that, in those diagrams. Like, who are all these people? What are they doing? What are the keywords they use? Oh, okay, let's okay. There's some kind of a spell here. This, like, we can string this into some kind of incantation, and something will emerge. And what emerged is this issue.
Yeah, for me, it's like transmission by wayfinding.
Yeah, right.
Cool. Thanks, Benita. Rain, could you ask your question?
Sure, thanks. So I think creating a new publication or a new form of media is really rich for this question of what's different about it. And we have the old broadcasting, centralized broadcast model, and we have the contemporary web, which is sort of like a weird amalgamation of total anarchy and decentralization, along with Twitter blasts that end up just being broadcasts anyway. So I'm curious how you see the relationship between the speaker and the audience changing, and if you imagine the side view having a new relationship between speaker and audience.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think a lot about these questions in terms of kind of having sedimented layers, or kind of like strata. I don't think this is an either or situation. I've been in learning environments where it was kind of completely horizontal, sort of circular. It's good for some things. It's really poor for other things. So I think it's important to maintain what's healthy and beneficial about that structure, and also look at other structures. And I think the same goes for the different types of ways that you're now able to put out writing. I think mostly about writing, and think about writing and editing and things like that. But you're never going to replace a book with a blog post. You're never going to replace a blog post with a tweet. but they can complement each other, and having like that kind of competency about what's the right medium for this idea is more interesting to me than, okay, we're not doing broadcast style anymore. We're not doing 300-page books anymore. We're just going to do online shareable Medium articles. Like, that doesn't make sense to me. So just finding the right mix of things is kind of how I think about it. And it's fascinating just seeing how this like switch from sort of podcast world to whatever this Zoom situation is kind of exemplifies something of a transition like that, where I think if this had happened, Peter, before the pandemic, you and I would probably be having a podcast, just you and I, about this. But for whatever reason, this is one of the second order effects of being stuck at home, is that now we do it like this. And I think that's very positive. So I think we should do more things like this because it kind of breaks some walls.
Right. So Raven has a question for me, so I'll let her ask that. And then I have a question for my number one frenemy, Jason Snyder. So Raven.
Hi, yeah, that really connects well to what you just said, Adam, actually, in the case of speaking about how the Stoa has emerged as a sense-making form that's around dialogue and communitas, and also about practice with the kind of psychotechnologies we've been experimenting with in the Wisdom Gym. So my question was about, is there a kind of a natural complement between the side view, its exploration of text, and the multimodality ways that we can get at the communication of things through artifacts, and also how the Stoa is treating interaction and practice and this live event format? And I think someone said in the chat, are they siblings? Are they lovers? Are they pen pals? So I don't know, Peter, if you have any insight into that question. Or
Yeah,
Adam.
yeah. I'm curious Adam's thoughts. I'll just say that I have philia for the side view. Maybe it's just because we have shared philosophical lineages with Hadot, but it seems like we're gesturing towards the same thing. And so any form of collaboration that can emerge, I'm very open to it. And you mentioned a question. I wanted to answer the question that you didn't ask there, but you wrote in the chat. It's like, can you speak on your piece of mimetic mediation? Is a Stoa kind of complement? I just want to mention that briefly, that Jason, Jared, and I, we have a mediation campfire every Sunday here at the Stoa at 3:30 p.m. Eastern time. And we talk about mimetic mediation, and maybe one definition of that is getting different mimetic tribes or different memes into right relationship with each other and how to do that. And the idea here is just to invite people from all these different ideologies, all these different philosophies in the wild, to get them warmed by the digital campfire. We had Michael Brooks. We have, he's a progressivist, Bernie Sanders supporter. We had Jack Murphy, he's a manosphere guy. Can they get warm around the campfire, and eventually can they or their followers come into dialogue with each other in this space? And so I kind of want the Stoa to be this sort of space where people can engage. So I have a question for Jason, but I'm curious if Adam has any thoughts on any of that.
Just yes. I mean, I think the more we can do this kind of cross-pollination, the better. I think about this. One, we're kind of creating a sort of an artifact that people can look at, but and think about on their own. But more, there's a kind of a question of culture and participating in a culture, and just taking responsibility for the fact that culture doesn't just happen. It has to be made, and it has to be made with some intention. And that's what I see, as kind of almost most important, is that it just like whole communities spring up around these conversations. And I have competencies and comfort zones that when I started the website, I knew it should be multimedia. I knew it should be podcasts and events, but the podcasts have always been more challenging for me, just because it's not where I feel highly competent. But writing and editing and getting into people's ideas and back and forth, and I can do that all day long. So I like the idea that we bring kind of a different emphasis to the work that we do, and I think that's important. But I wonder, Peter, maybe we can sort of bring in some of the writers. This is mostly their work, and me just trying to act as a kind of antenna / facilitator. So I mean, we also have. I see Ray down there, Brent. I can't see all of you, but I know you're out there. So
I'm curious. I'm just being cognizant of the time. We have 20 minutes. Do you have any question to any of the writers, Adam, directly?
No, I'm just so happy that this all came together, and I know, having written for a number of other publications myself, just how much of a labor of love it is, and how frustrating it is, and how, like, you can really grind your gears on this kind of stuff, and then it's not like we're getting paid tons of money to do this. So it's like I'm just extremely appreciative that everybody shows up and puts it like these. I've worked as an editor for universities all across the country for different journals, and like these are high quality thoughts and words, and I'm just in awe of all the people who just responded to the to the bat signal and showed up, and so thank all of you, because that's what this is really.
Mm-hmm. So Jeremy Johnson, you had shared a thought about the quarantine, about community. I'm curious if you would like to share it with the group.
Sure, yeah. Hey, everybody. So, yeah, just a quick comment that this time of physical separation has just so highlighted. I don't want to just say the value of community, but the practice of being together. That we're using these digital interfaces and Zoom calls and whatever else we're doing. Like I use Discord quite a bit to really kind of come at it as if it's a novelty, right? Like we haven't really used these social spaces online, in my experience anyway, since their early days like this, right? When YouTube was brand new and we could, Matt Segal's on here, we had a kind of an interesting video blog practice community where we would philosophize and send each other 10-minute videos and replies and have like a reply thread through video. And that was so exciting. It felt so genuine, and there's a kind of a genuineness, I think, in the way we're using Zoom and social media today that perhaps we had taken for granted for quite a while. So just sort of an interesting enantiodromia reversal of the way we're coming at these social technologies.
Yeah, totally. Raven, you have a question that you got a +1 on. Would you like to ask it?
Yeah, I would. And it seems like Greg also wrote an essay kind of about the subject. So if he feels invited to answer the question, I would really love to hear from him. So yeah, I was kind of, there has been a critique that meta-modernism and Game B, some of these emerging sense-making communities are lacking aesthetics. And I was wondering if the side view and its play with mediums is an emergence of an artistic movement in association with these intellectual practical movement.
I mean, I definitely think a lot about aesthetics. Aesthetics is not, we think of aesthetics as like, I think Tim Morton, the philosopher, had it right when he said we think of aesthetics as the sprinkles on the cupcake, but they're really much deeper. Aesthetics really matter, not just in the sense that it's nice to look at nicely designed things, but they're actually part of well, they're certainly part of the structure of nature, and they're part of the structure of our well-being in some important way. As for like artistic movements, I think these things are they just erupt, and there's no way to kind of say that that's what's happening. It's just you learn after the fact, And if you did it right, somebody else will give you a label for what you did, you know? So I don't, but aesthetics, yeah, in general, we should think more about it. Maybe Greg has something to say about meta-modernism.
Thanks. Well, I think my essay is kind of a foreigner, kind of in the world of the volume, and I'm a little bit of a foreigner here in this chat. So I kind of came to clarify what metamodernism's origins are as a term, and I don't know if you've had a chance to read my essay. But it actually originates as a theory of aesthetics specifically. And so it's a theory of contemporary aesthetics and aesthetics that have kind of been at play since around 2000. So the aesthetic movement and the aesthetic artifacts and cultural artifacts have already emerged. And are all around us. Then there's kind of this other sense of metamodernism, of the word metamodernism, that I think maybe a lot of the people here are familiar with, where it's a kind of proposed transformation to society. And I guess I can't really speak to whether it lacks the aesthetic dimension, although coming from my perspective, I think one of the things that's kind of unique about Game B is that it does have kind of a fun flavor to it that is almost an example of the kind of metamodernism that I talk about in my essay. So I'll just leave it at that.
Cool.
Can I just plug Greg's essay one more time, because he actually gives you some really clear examples from like pop cultural references that you'll all kind of recognize immediately. And it was actually reading Greg's essay where it sort of like the idea of metamodernism sort of really clicked for me in a different way, like what it was. And it was Greg's sort of just the ease with which he was able to kind of pull from the cultural regime of products and say, here, look at this, and then if you look at this, you'll see that the same thing is going on here. And I finally got the concept in a way where then I was kind of like walking around being like, oh, and this would also be an example, right? Yeah, okay, I get it now. Like I was able to like use it. I finally learned how to use the word in a sentence because of that essay. So make sure you check it out.
Beautiful. And I like how I was just reading Brent's essay too, and it had a good overview, like the intellectual history of metamodernism. So these essays seem like they really complement each other. And so we have about 15 minutes. We'll still continue with the structured format, and then we're going to have like a sense-making free-for-all when we stop pressing with the record. So you can hold on for that. But Benita, I know you said you wanted to add something there, and then I'm going to go to David's question.
Yeah, so I'm gonna geek out here a little. Other people can put their like geek filter headsets on so they don't hear it. So aesthetics, so I'm gonna go back to Kant. And maybe Adam, you can follow up after I say this. He had three critiques. He had a critique of pure reason, he had a critique of practical reason, and he had a critique of judgmental reason. And the only way out is aesthetic reason. And the difference between all of those is that aesthetic reason, so I want to say that like what we need to add, and I think the side view is doing this. Like it doesn't have pictures and it doesn't have artists, but I think Adam looks at the work not from pure reason, yes, from practical reason, not from judgmental reason, but I think he has this more like this aesthetic reason, which is every piece stands on its own in its whole, and it's kind of a concrete universal in its own expression. So you can't judge like this Vermeer is at this level of consciousness and this, Jackson Pollock, there's not this judgmental, there's not a rational approach. I think that when we look at what it is that the side view is doing, or what it is that we should be doing, this notion of aesthetic reasoning, I think is key. And I just wanted to make this statement, but yeah, I love the fact that we opened that portal.
I just want to comment real quickly because Matt Siegel linked in the chat to an essay that was published in issue 2 by Heidi Gustafsson, a friend of ours, and she has some kind of an aesthetic, some kind of a magical intuition in her painting, but also in she actually sources all of the minerals for her paints, and she writes in her essay about how she does that. And she is driven by an intelligence that is not the kind of explicit rationality that would typically be associated with sort of like going out into a landscape and finding minerals. And I think Bonita's right. There's signal there, and I try to translate whatever signal I'm getting into some kind of aesthetic for each piece.
Cool. David, you had a question?
Yeah. We've got a couple Davids.
Yeah. David, questions to Jason. Go for it.
Okay, thank you. I think Adam mentioned in response to Benita's question that he was surprised by the Toronto connection, that Peter and Christopher and John and David all knew each other from before. But I happen to know it goes quite a bit deeper than that, because I see you guys interacting on Twitter and guesting on each other's podcasts and in Slack. So my question for Jason is, how have the other authors here influenced your thinking and your article?
It's Jason Snyder, right? Jason, we can't hear you, or I can't hear you. Can anybody else hear Jason, or is it no? Okay, cool. He's just shouting like a madman into his computer right now. Now he's on a rampage, running downstairs.
It's a rampage.
Just hide the children. David's from Toronto too, so you kind of know the insider baseball here, David. Yeah, it's kind of weird what's happening here. There you go.
You can hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. Well, wow, that's a big question. I mean, I just feel very fortunate to have been included in the side view because I see many of the authors. I read them all at once, just in a marathon session, and I'm just kind of blown away at the level of insight and lateral thinking. Yeah, I mean, let's see. I've had many of these folks on our podcast. Jeremy is yet to be released, and how has it influenced my thinking? Well, I just feel like I'm trying to keep up, right? Like I just feel like there's so much, intelligence, collective intelligence, sharing ideas, emerging ideas, that I just try and keep up and, try and get a sense of, what is like some small little area that I can contribute to, in terms of, perhaps there's some kind of misunderstanding between, one particular person that we might have on our podcast or another. And that's where mimetic mediation comes in, is like, I'm just kind of like, where can there be a little bit more signal transfer instead of noise transfer? And, is this a fundamental disagreement that cannot be resolved, or is it some kind of misunderstanding? Yeah.
And Jason and I were supposed to actually write a piece together, but we couldn't mediate amongst ourselves, so we did separate pieces.
Bonita, that was one thing that surprised me. I forgot about that. They were going to co-write this piece, and then I get an email. I get one email from both of them, basically at the same time. They're like, I don't think it's going to work. I'm like, the mediators can't write a mediation piece? What is going on?
Yeah.
And then Can we tell the real story, Peter? Like, the real story is Peter didn't like what I wrote. And he was like, I don't want this to be part of my brand or something.
I think that's uncharitable to me. I think that's uncharitable. But I'll let it sit. I'll be stoic about that, the misinformation that you're providing them.
I'm hoping that I can mediate the two of them. I'm the third wheel here, so
Yeah,
we'll see what happens.
Jared needs to mediate the mediators.
Yes.
Exactly.
And usually I feel like a third wheel between you two, so I'm glad the roles have changed, Jared.
Not to drive a point home, but if we adopted aesthetic judgment, we would not need the realm of ideas to be mediated. See? We would not argue over what painting deserves its place on the wall.
A key point for my essay is that the engine of mediation is from a Kagan stage 3 point of view, which is relational and aesthetic. That's the connection I try to make. And so I agree with you, Bonita, that oftentimes sub-ideological aesthetic and relational connection is much more powerful than anything else.
So I'm going to jump in because this is getting fun. So I think we should pivot to the sense-making question. We only have 5 minutes left of the allotted time for the recorded portion. But before I pivot over and hand it to Raven, Adam, do you have any closing thoughts about, the episode or the issue or whatever?
I don't, but I if we have 5 minutes and if you're a contributor and you want to say something and you haven't been able to, please take 5 minutes.
And again, we have 30 plus minutes afterwards to jam together. But if anyone wants to say anything for the recorded portion.
I'm a past contributor and future contributor, and had a question good to see you. With the emphasis on ascesis or practice, I'm reminded while I was raised Southern Baptist and questions there were sort of, are you saved? As a practicing Buddhist, it's so refreshing that the question typically meeting another Buddhist is, what's your practice? And I'm interested in asking what you, Adam, do as practice, how it feeds you, how it benefits you. And we'll say as an immense compliment, how much I find your intelligence as a hopeful thing, a progressive thing, a contributing thing. So the question is also, and you can go any way you want with it, what's your practical hope?
I'm going to +1 that question hard. So I think this is a good one to bring us home.
Dave, thank you. So this is like the question that if you sort of sell yourself the way I sell myself, this is the question that you get. And I keep changing my relationship to the kind of answer I want to give to this question. At first it felt really inadequate. Like I didn't have I felt like people were asking for like my daily regimen, and like it had to be good. Like it had to be like really good. I'd be really disciplined, going deep all the time. And then I thought, no, just get into like kind of more like a list. Like these are the things that you do. And so I started giving lists of like the practices that I had. And then I had another teacher of mine just kind of comment like, oh, you're just so forthright about all of that. And he was like, he's an older gentleman. He's kind of like, in my day, we used to kind of, we weren't so open about it. It's good to show, don't tell, And I kind of like, all of a sudden I felt like I was being sort of silly or crass. So my relationship to that question changed again. And so now like, and Jason actually says something similar in his piece, because when we were editing it, I was kind of like, okay, so how does it work? Like take me through like some examples of how you do this mediation work. And he wrote in the essay, like, I'm not going to formalize this into a pedagogy. It's like, I have practices and they produce results, but we don't need to create this like bulleted list of things. And so I keep coming back to the question of like, how do I answer that question? And I really don't know like what a good answer for that question is, other than to, you know, I could tell you like silent meditation, martial arts, reading, study, contemplation, all of these things. But it's like, yeah, that is what it is. But I think in some sense, it comes down to something else. It comes down to something like having trust that your intuition goes somewhere. And then one, figuring out what the fuck is your intuition actually saying? And two, like follow it through. And like there's a lot of issues that crop up dealing with both of those sides of it. And so the practices are about getting clear on what that is, and then sort of being able to pursue it even when all kinds of other things throw you off course or try to convince you. This is sometimes those convincings, you know, take the shape of insecurity or a negative comment or some other extenuating circumstance that demands your attention. So it's just like, how do you staying focused on that thing, and the just to kind of bring it back to the second half of what David was saying, just that thing is whatever the side view is trying to be. And there's a lot on my side that goes into understanding how it works in all of these different facets, but like staying on that line is what the practice is.
Very, very cool. I can sign up for that. So we're going to close off this portion. If you have to leave, feel free to leave right now. And then we'll be in the sense-making portion in a moment. But first, Adam, thanks so much for launching this, coming today to the STOA.
Thank you.
And we're going to just plug a few events for those who have to leave right now at the STOA that are coming up. So tomorrow we have a stack day. We have Trauma, Truth, and Technology with Joshua Fields, this ridiculous, handsome Scottish man. That's at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Time. Relational Exegesis, which is a psychotechnology that Freyja is working with, where we read a text together and make comments on it live. And we're reading Keith Johnstone's Impro tomorrow, so that's really, really cool. And then Clyde Rathbone, the founder of Letter Wiki, we're talking about sort of my daily writing exercise and how, you know, the Stoic practice of writing to yourself. We're basically going to discuss that and see if we can inspire other people. That's all tomorrow. And Raven, could you talk about the event that we have Friday?
Yeah, of course. So on Friday, for those of you who don't know, I've been running a session called Socratic Speed Dating for the last few weeks. And one of the things that we've done in this is play a game called Ask Hole. And Ask Hole was created by a rationalist intellectual friend of mine who is a very interesting Twitter personality who asks very controversial questions. Her name is Ayla Girl, and she's going to be coming in an hour before talk about the game, its evolution, how it came out of the rationalist community, how she's used the game to like break social boundaries and kind of create her own set of psychotechnologies. So I'm going to be talking to her, and we'll be doing a Q&A session, and then afterwards we'll do an hour of playing Ask Hole. So it's always fun, and it would be lovely to see all of your faces there. Yeah,
it's Raven's doing a kick-ass job at the Socratic Speed Dating. It is so fun when we played that game last time, so I recommend it. So go to the website, thestoa.ca, to RSVP to those events, to sign up for the mailing list, and to look into the gift economy, which the Stoic is based off of. All right, so that being said, I'm going to stop record and then hand it over to Raven.